So welcome to this webinar by the Brody's Employment and Immigration team. I'm Brian Campbell, a director in the team, and I'm joined by Will Rollinson, an associate. And today we're looking at the subject of returning to the workplace. With it now being 6 months since we entered lockdown, schools are back, higher education is resuming, and for those of us lucky enough, holidays have been taken. And many businesses are now considering bringing people back into the workplace or making informal arrangements more structured. Now that's going to look different for each organisation, whether you're based in an office or a warehouse, a university, a hotel or whatever. And it will also feel different for every employee affected. So today we'll look at some of the legal and practical aspects of taking this important step back towards normality. So here's a summary of what we'll cover. First of all, the key question of whether the timing is right to bring people back at all. We'll also look at what you might need to do before bringing workers back to the workplace and some of the logistical ways that you can organise a return to work if that's what you decide to do. Then we'll move on to deal with some specific issues such as individuals' concerns and objections, and end with a look ahead at what may come next after you've managed a return programme. So the key question for many employers is now the right time? And this depends fundamentally on three different aspects. The first one's to do with your own business, your own organisation. So how significantly, how negatively has your business been hit by the COVID pandemic? Has there been an effect on your productivity or your service delivery, however you measure things? Has there been an effect internally in terms of things like team morale and cohesion? Are you experiencing challenges in managing people? So all of those are worth considering in terms of the importance of them on the decision as to whether now is the right time. And are these factors obvious? Would your staff appreciate them, or is it something that you have to explain or persuade them in relation to that? You may well be challenged down the line in terms of your motives or your reasons, so it's quite important to think about those and ideally document them or have evidence for them. And the next key aspect in relation to this is the individuals themselves and their own personal circumstances. Of course, as I say, everyone will be in a slightly different situation, and a return may be seen as a good or a bad thing by various individuals, or possibly a combination of both. So do people have health concerns, either in relation to themselves or other people in their household, that may influence their attitude to returning to work? Do they have concerns about how they'll get to or from work? Has home working worked well for them such that that's something that they now prefer? Or alternatively, have people struggled with home working, whether that's because of the technical issues or finding a quiet space to work or just missing out on more direct contact with their colleagues? And finally, we have the bigger picture, the external picture. Now, if you're in the sector where you, for example, manage theatres or nightclubs, then all of this is academic for you right now because you're not allowed to open at all. But for other sectors, such as, for example, call centres or cinemas or the hospitality sector, there is very specific guidance for you about what you should be thinking about in terms of bringing people back to work. Are you aware of that, and can you work within it? Because that may well influence whether now is the right time for you. And in addition to that, there is more general guidance which applies to everyone else. At the moment, as you may appreciate, it's slightly different depending on whether you're an employer in Scotland or in England. So in Scotland, the guidance is very much still that the default is to allow people to work from home where possible, whereas England, the approach is much more neutral, with the emphasis on making sure that workplaces are safe if people do decide or people are asked to return to the workplace. And what's the status of that guidance? Well, it's not something that carries immediate sanctions in itself. It is only guidance, and so there won't be any immediate penalty if you decide to go against it. But it may play into conversations that you have down the line with individual members of staff in terms of their attitudes to returning. It may be that if you're going against the guidance, that slightly strengthens the hand of one of your employees if they ask, for example, for a particular flexible measure which you have reservations about giving them. And finally, let's not forget that things could change at short notice. As we speak, of course, restrictions seem to be increasing rather than being eased in the wider world, based on the number of positive cases which are being reported. And many of us are looking ahead to what the winter may bring in terms of a spike in cases or the effect of the change in climate. So think about that as well. These things at the more extreme may result in new restrictions on your particular sector, your particular business. But even if they don't, even if they're more general, they may influence how people feel about returning to work. If, for example, their home life is affected because they suddenly struggle to secure childcare, or just don't have the same willingness as the winter draws in to coming into work. So if you've decided that now is the right time, let's look at some practical and legal steps. What's your responsibility as an employer if you decide to bring staff back? Well, that goes all the way back to 1970s health and safety legislation, and essentially you have to protect your workers from harm. And of course, very currently, that means taking reasonable steps to make sure that they aren't infected by COVID-19. And a key aspect of this clearly is to conduct risk assessments of your premises and your practices, looking at such questions as which situations could cause transmission, who might be at risk, and what's the level of risk, the degree of exposure, and possible consequences. And finally, how can the risk be removed or controlled? Now, there's plenty of assistance in relation to this if you need it, for example, on the HSE website, and there are template risk assessment documents that you can find there if you need to. As advised certainly by the Scottish guidance, you should share your risk assessments with your workers if indeed you're not involving them as you carry them out. Think about that as well. And equally, don't forget that the obligation on you as an employer to assess risk is an ongoing one. So reviewing your risk assessments is very important. You may well want to put a date in the diary, whether it's 4 or 6 weeks ahead of the beginning of the return programme, just to check how that's going and to see if any adjustments need to be made. Also, you should consider more specific risk assessments for certain individuals. That might literally be a particular person, or it may be categories of individuals, such as, for example, people who have underlying health conditions or disabilities, workers who perhaps are older and at more risk of COVID, individuals who have mobility restrictions and maybe can't use certain ways of getting around your office or your building, or obey particular restrictions that you have in relation to that. And guidance is out there. I mentioned the HSE already. They have a particularly useful guidance document which is entitled Talking with Your Workers About Preventing Coronavirus. And that, in addition to their templates, is very useful in terms of a starting point. Now, a question may arise for you as to whether you're responsible in any way for your staff outside of the office, not so much home working, which of course has its own responsibilities, but how about people getting to and from work? Well, in a strict health and safety sense or a personal injury sense, the answer is that you're not responsible for their commute. But of course, that may play into a bigger picture in the employment sense. If people have genuine challenges and reservations about getting to and from work, then that may well be something that you as an employer have to take into account in terms of your expectations of them. So let's look now at some of your options and measures in a practical sense. The two main approaches that seem to have become more prevalent are, first of all, a phased or a staged return, and secondly, a rotational approach. So the first one, as the title suggests, it will be driven by your structure, your own individual needs as an employer, and also the physical limitations of your premises. You'll still have to think about how to fit people into each wave or each phase, and think in particular about whether returning is a positive or negative thing for individuals. So you may have to look at your business in terms of how you structure the wave, and whether it's team by team, or whether you want certain people from each department to come back so that you've got a representation of all parts of your business. And as I say, is it a positive or a negative thing for individuals? The answer may not be apparent. So if you've got people who are being paid to work at home, they may not be particularly keen or bothered about returning in the first waves. But if you've got people who are on furlough at the moment and receiving furlough pay, they may well want to return to work if that represents an increase in a return to full pay. And it may well be there's an association in people's minds with status or importance attached to being brought back in one of the earlier waves rather than the later ones. So all of these things may have to factor into your considerations. Rotation is just similar, so rather than bringing people back in waves, you'll have people on and off. It may be 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, or whatever, which will allow you to bring more people back sooner. But again, you'll probably have many of the same considerations about how you do that. So you'll need to again think about individuals' attitudes and how you structure and select who will be involved in each rotation. Whether or not you go for either of these or something else, there are some additional measures that might be worth considering. So first of all, do you want to allow people to return on an optional basis, or whether you will require them to return when you tell them? Do you want to offer people the opportunity to work shorter or longer hours, so they may only be in for part of their working day, at least to begin with, or on a longer term basis? Can they compress their normal working week into a smaller number of days, which at least deals with the commute concern? And do you want to stagger start and finish time so that you don't have everyone arriving or leaving around the same time? Do you want to consider giving people assistance with their travel if that's a particular concern with them? It may even extend in some circumstances to providing parking for people who might be able to drive into work rather than take public transport, or giving financial assistance if it involves getting a slightly more secure method of transport, such as, for example, an Uber or a taxi, as opposed to a train or a bus. And also you want to consider just basic hygiene measures and things like that, distancing policy, and thinking about whether you want to have a policy on masks within your workplace, which is still very much optional. These are all things to consider in among the general structure of how and when you bring people back. And finally, a key question, how much of a say do you allow your staff, your workers in all of these decisions? Ideally, this is something that you want to go all the way back to the beginning to think about, and many employers have begun the process by issuing a questionnaire or otherwise canvassing the views of the staff to get a better understanding of people's circumstances, attitudes, and limitations. So you can do that. Even if you don't, there may be ways along the way as you implement your plan that you can allow them to have a say. So do you let, as I say, people drop in during the rotation time rather than have to be in? Do you allow them to come to you and ask for flexibility, something that we'll touch on, and so on. There are lots of different things that you can think about, because after all, we haven't really been handed the script for this pandemic, and therefore it does involve a lot of questions and a lot of learning along the way.
Thanks, Brian. So I'm going to touch on individual concerns and objections, and focusing mainly on health and safety and discrimination risks there, and then also just how you deal with some of the tricky issues where people might be objecting it's coming back, or where they might be saying, look, I'm still a bit worried about this. And then, as Brian said at the start, we'll then have a little bit of time at the end for looking ahead before moving on to questions. So in terms of health and safety, I suppose one of the things to think about is, even with the best will in the world, if an employer has done all their risk assessments and done all the things that Brian's been talking about, people are still concerned about this. You know, especially at the moment with the cases on the rise again, people will still have legitimate concerns either about their own health, or if it's someone that they live with or someone that they come into close contact with. And so we anticipate that employers in particular, will still be facing questions from people who have yet to return to work around, well, what have you done to make me feel safe? So we don't think that this is going to be something that's just going to go away. And I put there that this really is a different landscape than before. This is something which has obviously been front and center of everyone's minds for the past 6 months, and it still doesn't show any sign of sort of abating or going back to whatever normal might be. And so people are still going to come to you and say, well, you might have done this, you might have put in place this risk assessment, but I'm not safe and I don't want to come back. So what do you do about that? I think there's also the fact that people are going to be more aware of their rights at the moment, just with everything being so front and centre in the press, and the fact that people have at the touch of a button the ability to go to ACAS's website, Citizens Advice Bureau, they can check legislation if they're a little bit more up to speed on what they might want to be looking into, and a couple of those calls or a couple of emails to an advice service might show them, you know, that they can blow the whistle, that they can raise health and safety concerns, and what sort of protections are in place for them. So I'm going to focus mainly just on whistleblowing and health and safety because there's an interplay and also an overlap between those two. Typically, I think your whistleblowing issues are going to be people saying, right, well, I'm going to make a disclosure. I'm going to say, I think you've not done something correctly as my employer. The most likely one here being, I don't think you've made the workplace safe. And therefore, if I am subjected to any unfavourable treatment, a detriment, or if I am ultimately dismissed, or even if I resign because of that and claim that I've been constructively dismissed, then I think I'm protected. Likewise, health and safety can actually be one of the grounds on which you can make a protected disclosure, but there's also a separate provision in the Employment Rights Act which allows an employee, amongst other things, to say, I think there's an imminent risk to my health and safety in the workplace, and therefore I'm either going to leave the workplace if they've been there, or I'm not going to return. And again, they will have protection in certain circumstances from any unfavourable treatment which amounts to a detriment or from being dismissed. And so the main risk of claims in relation to people who are putting that before you are automatic unfair dismissal claims. If they say the principal reason or the reason for my dismissal is because I've either blown the whistle or because I've said I'm at risk if I return to work. But as I say, also in relation to detriment. And why is that important? Well, first of all, as we know, there's no tribunal fees, so people can pursue claims relatively easily right now. But also, in these types of claims, for automatic unfair dismissal, the compensation cap of 1 year's salary does not apply. So if someone is going to be out of work for a particularly long time, following either a dismissal or a constructive dismissal, the compensation can and could rack up, but also in relation to detriment claims, and similar to the way that it's available in discrimination claims, individuals can pursue damages for injury to feelings. And then there's also reputational damage. I mean, as I said, at the moment, there's lots of people who might just decide to go straight to the press and say, this employer wants me to come back. I don't think they've put in place the appropriate safeguards, and let's name and shame. So all things just to bear in the back of your mind. So we'll move on now to discrimination. So Brian's already touched a little bit upon who you might bring back and how you might go about doing that. But you're in the classic territory of thinking about, well, if there is a requirement to bring back a certain category of people, is that on its own a provision, criterion, or practice, which is the language used in the Equality Act when you're thinking about things like indirect discrimination claims and failure to make reasonable adjustments where there's a disability. So just looking at those very briefly, if someone can say, I have a protected characteristic, for instance, disability, I think the PCP that you are putting in place as my employer puts me at a substantial disadvantage when compared to people who don't have it, then they can say that they've been indirectly discriminated against, and if you don't alleviate the disadvantage that they suffer by making a reasonable adjustment, they can then claim that they've also suffered discrimination on the grounds that you've not made a reasonable adjustment for them. The characteristics that I think are most likely to be in play here are, number one, disability. There is the possibility that you could have sex discrimination claims, the classic example being if whatever you're putting in place somehow disadvantages men or women, even inadvertently. And then again, you're back in this classic territory of indirect discrimination claims. Maternity I've put there really just as a flagging point in case, with the best will in the world, you know, we're all trying to keep up with who is on furlough, who isn't on furlough, who's on maternity leave. But it's one of those classic areas where we see people often forgetting or overlooking if staff are still on maternity leave when you're putting in plans such as these. And if it's coming to an end, have we communicated with them what we're going to do? So that's just more an individual risk to be thinking about. And then there is the possibility, I suppose, with race as well. There's been a lot of coverage in the press about BAME, people perhaps being more at risk from suffering COVID, or the instances of COVID being more prevalent in those communities. So is there a risk that whatever your plans are could potentially be putting them at more risk when compared with other people? And again, that goes back to your indirect discrimination claim potentially. And lastly, I also wanted to just touch on what constitutes a disability may have changed. Now, that's not to say there's been any legislative change. The test in the Equality Act, which is found in Section 6, is still the same. So I've put it there. But the key bits that I've highlighted in bold are to think about, well, has the coronavirus and the restrictions that have been put in place made what might not have actually really restricted someone with an underlying health condition in the past from being disabled, has it now made their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities different? And if it has, is something that wasn't previously a disability now going to be considered one? There's not going to be a quick answer there, and it will depend on each individual person's circumstances. And again, they still need to meet the test for it having a substantial adverse effect, and it also needs to be long-term. And so if there is going to be a vaccine in the next couple of months, query if the start of the pandemic to the end of it means that it will meet that test, but certainly one to be thinking about. Moving on then to dealing with some of the tricky issues around individuals' concerns. The first two there, discipline and grievance and hearings, are largely interlinked. And I suppose the point is, if you haven't yet brought anyone back, and there are still many employers who have pretty much everyone on furlough, are you going to be in a position where you can actually deal with a grievance? Do you have someone on the ground or working home remotely who can do that? Likewise, if the person raising a concern and who wants it to be dealt with as a formal grievance says, well, I'm not coming to the workplace, then they're less likely to then be coming for a grievance meeting. So are you able to put in place remote hearings? Can be done either by Zoom or by Microsoft Teams, or can you do a teleconference? And if not, is there another way you can do it, potentially taking comments in writing and corresponding that way? And that'll apply to any sort of disciplinary issues which you might face as well, and I'll come on to that in a second. But one of the other things that you might come up against, and I suspect that quite a few people, employees particularly, will try this avenue, is that if they say, no, I'm not coming back because I've got a concern, I've got an underlying health condition, and no matter what you do, I just don't think I'll be safe. And if we insist on them coming back, do they just then go to their doctor, get a sick line and say, well, I'm certified as sick, either through stress or concern or through health and safety worries, and then say, well, I've got a sick line here. And then what do you do with those people? And that's not going to be easy to answer. However, there may be some cases where people might not be raising legitimate concerns, and that after you've done your investigation, looked into what they're saying, you've gone back and checked what your risk assessment says, and actually this doesn't really look like a very well-founded concern, and you think they might just be trying it on, do you then kick into a disciplinary process and decide, actually, if you remain away from the workplace, we're going to say that that's without official authorization, or do you withhold pay? Again, not an easy one to answer, and given what I've said in relation to the last couple of slides around the potential exposures here, if someone says, I've raised a health and safety concern and then you've not paid me, do they then bring a detriment claim against you, or do they resign and then claim constructive dismissal? And lastly, just very briefly, track and trace. Are you going to ask people to download apps? We know that Scotland's got its own track and trace app now, and I think England has theirs as well, England and Wales. Are you going to ask people to do that? And if so, are you actually going to ask for any information from them about it? And I suppose you've just got to think about all the tricky issues around data protection if you are going to try and get any information from them about that, and how you process it and what you do with it. And then lastly, looking ahead. So, let's say you've managed to get your return to the workplace, it's gone swimmingly and it's great. You've dealt with all those tricky issues, but we know there is still a pandemic on the go. So what do we think are going to be the issues that you might face? There is always, I think, the prospect that even if your organisation is able to weather the storm, others might not be so readily able to do so. If that has an impact on your business and you realise that you don't require the same number of people, even though you've still got orders coming in, do you then have to go through a redundancy exercise? And just thinking about When you've got 20 or more, you're then into collective consultation territory. I'm not going to go into detail about that now, but just thinking about that. Also, we know that the government has legislated to make sure that when people are getting their redundancy pay, it is based on their normal pay, subject to the cap on a week's pay, but it's not necessarily going to be based on their furloughed pay. So keeping that in mind as well. Are you going to vary terms and conditions instead? So can you agree with your staff that they will cut pay, or that they will have some benefits removed, or that they will work temporarily on different patterns? And the last two there are really just to flag what our next webinars are going to be on. So I'm not going to go into detail about them, but supervision being, how do you manage a remote workforce, or one where you've got them returned to work and then sometimes working from home? And then lastly, in relation to flexible working, we think that there will be a massive increase in the number of people who've been working perfectly fine from home for the past 6 months who will say, well, from now on, I want to do that. And the government has also signalled that they may very well look into introducing some sort of ability to request the right to work from home permanently. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with those. So I think that's everything that I was going to cover here. If we now want to move on to some of the questions.
Thanks very much, Will. Just conscious of the time, I think we could probably deal with one or two questions. So the first one is, if an employer sees, for example, by way of social media, that one of its staff may perhaps not be obeying appropriate guidance or restrictions in their private life, are they able to take any action in relation to that person in the workplace?
Yeah, I'll take that one. That's an interesting one. I think it's always going to depend on what an individual's circumstances are. I mean, typically, if we go back to the example that I was sort of touching upon there, if we think someone's at it and they've not come back to the workplace, and then you see on social media, or one of your colleagues sees on social media, that actually they're perfectly healthy, they're fit and they're out and about and they're doing all these other sorts of things which might equally pose a risk to their health, then yeah, query if you'd be saying to them, well, look, appreciate you're saying you can't come into the workplace, but we noticed you've been out in the pub, you've been out here, or we're hearing in the press all the time about people who've been at house parties and that sort of thing. If they're putting themselves in harm's way elsewhere and you've got evidence of that, then I think that's going to put you on far firmer ground in terms of taking or at least instigating disciplinary action against them. If someone, though, is in your workplace as well, I suppose there's the question of whether or not someone has returned to work, but in the meantime they've been going to parties and doing all that other stuff, but they've been abiding by the rules in the workplace. Query if other people then might say, well, I feel at risk having to work with them. And that's never going to be a tricky, an easy one to deal with. That's always going to be a very tricky issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another interesting question we have here, if one of our employees tests positive for COVID, do we need to tell their colleagues? Which is certainly an interesting question. This is a delicate one, I think, because it obviously involves issues in relation to both data protection and trust and confidence, both in relation to the individual who's tested positive, of course, and their colleagues. So I think very much it's a balancing act. You've got people with their rights and expectations on both sides of that. And what you might want to do initially is ask the individual whether they would consent to their colleagues being made aware of that. If they said yes, that might make the situation simpler and you could release the information. If they say no, or you can't get the consent by another means, then I think you're going to have to think about the pros and cons of that and where the risk lies. How great is the risk that that individual may potentially have been exposed to and infected their colleagues? It may be a very low risk, depending on what the movements are and how your workplace is structured. But you need to think about that. But you will need to think about the rights of the individual when effectively what you're doing is releasing quite sensitive in any sense of the word, but certainly a legal sense, information about them and their health. So it may be that you either say that one of the person's colleagues has tested positive, you release limited information if you can't get consent, or it may well be that you have to decide, well, actually, we're not going to do anything right now because we're satisfied the level of risk of exposure of other colleagues is low, and it's a situation that you just monitor. But it is one that you're going to have to think about very clearly if and when you start bringing your colleagues back to work. Well, just conscious of time, I think that's probably all we have time for. Thank you very much for your attendance. Just by way of a reminder, as Will said, this is one in a series of 3, so in the coming weeks we'll deal more closely with the related subjects of managing flexible working requests and also managing individuals remotely. So please look out for those and do attend if you can. And it just remains for me to thank you for your attendance. Thank you very much.
Thanks.